Good evening. I wanted to read this book called The Son of God by Martin Hengel, The Origin of Christology and the History of the Jewish Hellenistic Religion. This was recommended to me actually from Father Thomas Hopko in his Names of Jesus podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. And based on the title, I thought it would be interesting given the discussions we've been having. So, firstly, I'm going to read a little bit about his life. Who is Martin Hengel, the author? According to Wikipedia, zoom in here. Martin Hengel, born 14 December 1926, died 2nd July 2009, was a German historian religion, focusing on the Second Temple period or Hellenistic period of early Judaism and Christianity. Biography. Hengel was born in Reutlingen, south of Stuttgart, in 1926 and grew up in nearby Aalen. In 1943, he was conscripted as a 17-year-old schoolboy into the Wehrmacht and served in an anti-aircraft battery on the Western Front. In 1945, after one of the final battles of World War II, he threw away his weapons and uniform and walked home from France, completing his schooling in 1946. In late 1947, Hengel began his theological studies in Tübingen, moving to the University of Heidelberg in 1949. In 1951, he qualified as a Lutheran parish minister, but in 1954 his father voiced his opposition to this and insisted that he joined Hengela, the family textile business in Aalen, which makes women's underwear and lingerie. This caused a 10-year struggle for Hengel, who had to study when he could based around his working hours. The strain on his health led to a serious breakdown. He later referred to these 10 years as wasted years and gave the impression of almost having an inferiority complex about the amount of study he had been forced to miss. However, he remained a director of the company until his death. In August 1957, he married Marianne Kistler. For a short period, he was also able to lecture at the Theological College and served as an assistant to Professor Otto Michel in Tübingen, but this ended in 1957 when he was sent to manage a factory in Leicester for several years. He continued to work on his doctoral thesis in his spare time. Hengel graduated in 1959 with a PhD. He completed his postgraduate work on his habilitation thesis, a requirement for academic teaching at the University of Tübingen in 1967. His thesis was concerned with Judaism and Hellenism. He was a professor at the University of Erlangen starting in 1968. In 1972, Hengel returned to Tübingen and to succeed Professor Michel. Recognized as one of the greatest theological scholars of his time, Martin Hengel focused a great amount of his studies upon the New Testament, as well as other theological writings of early Christianity. Hengel specialized in the early period of Rabbinic Judaism, including early Christianity and the origins of Christianity. Throughout his writing, Hengel openly recognizes the challenges involved in developing a thorough history of early Christianity. Due to the fact that the sources available to scholars are often found surviving in fragments, as a result, the sparseness of the sources vitiates our knowledge of large areas of the ancient world. In his article, Raising the Bar, a daring proposal for the future of evangelical New Testament scholarship, Hengel therefore challenges scholars to delve into a more extensive biblical research to ensure proper understandings of the text being established. Hengel's Christology strove to share an accurate illumination of who Jesus was and what he did, and sought after as well the notion that Christianity emerged completely from within Judaism. After his experience as a soldier in the Second World War, Hengel said, "As for these specific errors that have affected my own country, today one may say that amongst the most important insights of our field of study since the Second World War belongs to the recognition of how deeply rooted earliest Christianity is in Judaism as its native soil. This implies that the study of pre-Christian Judaism of the Hellenistic period as a whole, that is, from the 4th century BCE, is to be included in our field of study. Here, Old and New Testament scholars must work hand in hand." Not only did Hengel desire that scholars work hand in hand, but also was known for supporting scholars of all backgrounds. In 1992, he was Emeritus Professor of New Testament Early Judaism at the University of Tübingen. This period of Judaism includes early Christianity and the field known as Christian origins. Much scholarly work is currently being done around the intersection of Hellenism, Judaism, paganism, and Christianity, and the ways in which these terms are potentially problematic for the Second Temple era. Such work of the past 2 or 3 decades follows 50 years of work by Hengel, who reconceptualized the scholarly approach to the period in such works as Judentum und Hellenismus, and other scholars. Within his studies of Rabbinic Judaism and the origins of Christianity, Hengel explored the perceived dichotomy between Judaism and Hellenism. In his study Judentum und Hellenismus, he documented that the designation of the Apostle Paul exclusively as either Jewish or Hellenistic is a misunderstanding. Hengel argues in his writings that despite Paul's controversial rhetoric, scholars, along with Jewish and Christian communities, must recognize the historical value of Paul's epistles and Luke's account of Paul's life within the Acts of the Apostles. Hengel recognizes the importance of this awareness because of the multifaceted insight provided about the Second Temple era and Hellenistic Judaism of the first century within these texts. A large portion of Martin Hengel's research on the canonical book, The Acts of the Apostles, focuses on the time in which Paul spends between his time in Damascus and Antioch, coining these years as the unknown years. I have that book as well, and if I enjoy this one, maybe we'll do that one next. Between Acts and the letters of Paul, Hengel, among other scholars, attempts to piece together the extent of the missionary work of Paul the Apostle. Hengel highlights Paul as an apostle to all nations throughout his interpretations. He also highlights the miracle of the preservation of the letters of Paul and acknowledges, in correlation with the book of Acts, which set the letters within a historical context, we receive the nucleus of quite a new form of theological writing in earliest Christianity, and thus also for the New Testament canon. He considered the traditional account of the Gospel of Mark was written by Peter's interpreter, John Mark, also known as Mark the Evangelist, to be essentially credible. He also believed that Luke the Evangelist, the companion of Paul the Apostle, was the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. His Institute for Ancient Judaism and Hellenistic Religion attracted scholars from all over the world, including Israel, and Philip Melanchthon Foundation, which he founded, brought young scholars close to the world of Greek and Roman antiquity. He received honorary doctorates from the universities of Uppsala, St. Andrews, Cambridge, Durham, Strasbourg, and Dublin. He was a corresponding member of the British Academy of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Hengel died around age 82 in Tübingen and is survived by his wife, Marianne. Works, whole bunch of them, references, etc. Interesting. The Son of God. Table of Contents. 1. Chapter 1, The Problem. Chapter 2, Criticism. Chapter 3, The Testimony of Paul. Chapter 4, The Theory of the History of Religions School. Chapter 5, The Meaning of Son of God and the History of Religions. Sounds like that's where the meat is in this book. Chapter 6, The Problem of the Rise of Early Christianity. Chapter 7, The Son in the Epistle to the Hebrews, the Crucified and Exalted Jesus. Chapter 8, Theological Conclusions. To Eberhard Jungel on his Swabian coming of age. As is well known, Swabians do not come of age until that time when life is said to begin, at 40. Okay, I have something to look forward to in 2 years. Preface by Martin Hengel. This study is based on my inaugural lecture at Tübingen on 16 May 1973. Despite necessary expansions, I have deliberately kept to the structure and argument of the lecture. The work as a whole is meant to be a contribution to the critical discussion of New Testament Christology, which today has become a notable battleground. I am concerned to demonstrate that historical scholarship and theological, one might even say dogmatic, questions must not stand in unresolved contradiction to each other. On the contrary, the historian misunderstands the nature of New Testament Christology unless he grasps its theological concern and its inner consistency, while a dogmatic approach which does not take seriously the historical cause of Christology, during the first decades of primitive Christianity is in danger of becoming no more than abstract speculation. At a time when historical positivism and hermeneutical interest largely go their own ways in New Testament scholarship, it's vitally important to reunite historical research and the theological search for truth. I'm grateful for Fraulein Cordelia Kopsch for typing the manuscript, to Dr. Andreas Nissen for his supervision of it, and to Herr Helmut Kienle for his careful reading of the proofs. Martin Hengel, Tübingen, New Year, 1975. Chapter 1. The Problem. At the feast of the Passover in the year 30, in Jerusalem, a Galilean Jew was nailed to the cross for claiming to be Messiah. About 25 years later, the former Pharisee Paul quotes a hymn about this crucified man in a letter which he writes to one of the communities of the Messianic sect which he has founded in the Roman colony of Philippi. Quote, "He was in the form of God, but did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of man and found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross." Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 and 8 through 8. The discrepancy between the shameful death of a Jewish state criminal and the confession that depicts this executed man as a pre-existent divine figure who becomes man and humbles himself to a slave's death is, as far as I can see, without analogy in the ancient world. It also illuminates the riddle of the origin of the Christology of the early church. Paul founded the community in Philippi in about the year AD 49, and in the letter which he wrote to the believers, there are about 6 or 7 years later. He wrote to the believers there about 6 or 7 years later. He will have presented the same Christ as in the preaching which brought the community into being. This means that the apotheosis of the crucified Jesus must already have taken place in the 40s, and one is tempted to say that more happened in this period of less than 2 decades than in the whole of the next 7 centuries, up to the time when the doctrine of the early church was completed. Indeed, one might even ask whether the formation of doctrine in the early church was essentially more than a consistent development and completion of what had already been unfolded in the primal event of the first 2 decades, but in the language and thought forms of Greek, which was its necessary setting. I think Jacob would agree with that a lot changed. So the problem is that Jesus was crucified in year 30 claiming to be Messiah, and Paul's confession that he is a pre-existent divine figure, and that all of that happened, over the course of 2 decades. He founded the community in Philippi in 49, and the letter he wrote about 6 or 7 years later includes that hymn. Okay, chapter 2, criticism. This, of course, is the point at which modern criticism begins. No less a scholar than Adolf von Harnack lamented the development, quote, as the history of the suppression of the historical Christ by the pre-existent Christ, the real Christ by the fictitious Christ in dogmatics, end quote. For, quote, this apparent enrichment of Christ amounted to an impoverishment, because it in fact obliterated the complete human personality of Christ, end quote. Yeah. While he celebrated Paul as the founder of, quote, Western and Christian civilization, unquote, in What is Christianity, he also saw a danger that, quote, under the influence of the messianic dogmas and led by the impression which Christ made, Paul became the author of the speculative idea that not only was God in Christ, but that Christ himself was possessed of a peculiar nature of a heavenly kind. Christ's appearance in itself, the entrance of a divine being into the world, came of necessity to rank as the chief fact, as itself the real redemption." Unquote. Of course, that was not yet the case with Paul, since for him the cross and resurrection were crucial facts, and the incarnation could be interpreted in moral terms as, quote, "an example for us to follow," unquote. But the incarnation, quote, "could not permanently occupy the second place. It was too large." However, when moved into the first place, it threatened the very existence of the gospel by drawing away men's thoughts and interests in another direction. When we look at the history of the dogma, who can deny that this is what happened? Unquote. I had thought that the incarnation is where it was at. Okay. But this means the dogmatic confession of faith, quote, "The living faith seems to be transformed into a creed to be believed, devotion to Christ and to Christology," unquote. Thus, Harnack's critical observations, which may be regarded as characteristic of the Christological thought of wider circles of modern Protestantism, in contrast to, quote, "speculative progress," unquote, there was a demand for a return to the simple gospel of Jesus, unburdened by Christological speculation, since, to use Harnack's words once more, "the gospel as Jesus proclaimed it has to do with the Father only and not with the Son." Jewish scholars made the same kind of criticism. The Galilean was rediscovered in modern Jewish scholarship, and attempts were made to bring him home to Judaism. Apostasy from the faith of the fathers began, rather, with Paul. As an example, we may take the picture of Paul drawn by the Erlangen philosopher of religion H.J. Schoeps. It was Paul who, for the first time, reflecting on the messianic figure of Jesus, made out of a title of dignity an ontological affirmation, and raised it to a mythical level of thought. His, quote, "Christ has become a supernatural being and approximates to Gnostic heavenly beings. This heavenly Christ seems to have wholly absorbed the earthly Jesus into himself. The myth clearly represented here points to pagan spheres," unquote. More specifically to the religious syncretism of Asia Minor. Schoeps' verdict is consistent and clear. Quote, "Hence we see in Ius Theou belief the soul, albeit decisive heathen premise of Pauline thought. All that belongs to and flows from it is un-Jewish and akin to heathen ideas of the time." Man. When Pauline Christology and soteriology combined with this un-Jewish belief in the Son of God and became the dogma of the Christian Church, it burst the framework of Jewish belief once and for all. Schoeps concludes with a reference to Harnack's verdict. Quote, "The acute Hellenization of Christianity, so much discussed in this day, takes place at this point." Man. Jacob, you must have read some of this stuff. Have you heard of Schoeps? It would be fascinating to trace further this encounter between Reformed Judaism and liberal Protestantism in their criticism of Christological dogma, but the responsible theologian, historian, and exegete can no longer be satisfied with D.F. Strauss's much-repeated remark: "The true criticism of dogma is its history." He must attempt rather not only to analyze the historical derivation of the conceptions and terms created by the early Christian belief, but also to understand them and interpret them theologically. This task always includes a critical examination of earlier criticism. Okay. I think I have chosen the right book to read. This is what I'm interested in right now. Chapter 3. The Testimony of Paul. How many pages is it? Okay, I think we can read all that. Let us begin with the earliest primitive Christian evidence that we have, the authentic letters of Paul. Statistical evidence alone seems to contradict Schoep's view that the title Son of God is of central significance for Paul. For Paul uses two titles, Lord and Son of God, which describe Jesus in a special way as an exalted heavenly figure quite disproportionately. Whereas he uses Kyrios 184 times, we only find Ios Theou 15 times. Kyrios 184 times, and Ios Theou 15 times. The distribution of the two terms is striking. Son of God appears most frequently in the letters where the controversy with the Jewish tradition is at its height, in Romans and Galatians, where Galatians 7 and 4 times respectively, whereas the two letters addressed to the community in Corinth, which was now really threatened with acute Hellenization, contained Son of God only 3 times. There was a danger there, in true Greek fashion, that the new message would be interpreted not in Gnostic terms, but following a false interpretation of Paul's doctrine of freedom, as a doctrine of salvation along the lines of the cult of Dionysius and Dionysus and the mysteries. Kramer, who has made the most recent analysis of the Christological titles in Paul, comes to a quite different result from Schoep's on the basis of the statistical evidence and form critical analyses. 1. In Paul's view, both the title Son of God and the ideas associated with it are of relatively minor importance. 2. Paul usually employs the term in stereotyped formulas which he has taken over from earlier tradition, and, quote, the original meaning of the title has already faded, unquote. Now this means that the alleged lapse into the speculative Hellenization of Christology must have already taken place in the early church before the time of Paul. Before we turn to the difficult question of the historical derivation of the title Son of God, we must therefore examine Kramer's two arguments. Let us first turn to the significance of the title in Paul. The significance could depend not only in statistics, but also on the context of the use of the title within Paul's letters. It is striking that the title appears 3 times right at the beginning of Romans in the introduction, and that Paul uses it to describe the content of his gospel. It occurs 3 times again at the climax of the letter, in chapter 8, the point of which could be summed up in a single sentence. The Son of God makes us sons of God, who are to participate in his heavenly doxa. This indicates that for Paul the soteriological rather than speculative significance of the term stands in the foreground. Galatians makes the same impressions. Here, Son of God appears at the beginning of the letter in connection with a radical change in the apostles' way of life. But when he, God, who had set me apart before I was born, and had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Here Paul shows at the same time that Son of God is the real content of his gospel. We find the title also, just as in Romans 8, at the climax of the letter. But when the time had fully come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. The point again is clearly soteriological. The Son of God frees us to become sons of God. This finding is confirmed by a quite different text at the beginning of 2 Corinthians. As surely as God is faithful, our word to you has not been yes and no. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, whom we preached among you, was not yes and no, but in him it is always yes. Here too the content of the apostles' message is Son of God. As Bachmann already observed in his commentary, the solemn use of the title Son emphasizes that the Son belongs together with the Father. In his incarnation, God's yes is clearly spoken to abandoned man, for all the promises of God find their yes in him, and because through the Son God's yes has become reality for all men, the community can conclude and endorse its prayer to the glory of God through him with the yes of the Amen. In 1 Corinthians 2, the Son appears at the beginning of the letter, and then again at a climax, at the end of all things, when even the last power, death, has been conquered by the parousia of Christ and the general resurrection. The Son himself will also be subjected to him who put all things under him, that God may be everything to everyone. Thus Paul uses the term Son to describe as the content of his mission preaching not only the pre-existent and incarnate Redeemer of the world, but also the perfecter of creation and history. He does the same thing in his earliest writing, 1 Thessalonians 1:10, who speaks of the expectation of the Son coming from heaven, who delivers us from the wrath to come. It is also striking that in almost all his statements about the Son of God, Paul uses the title when he is speaking of the close bond between Jesus Christ and God, that is, of his function as the mediator of salvation between God and man. We must therefore support the old master of the history of religion school, W. Bousset, against Kramer when he observes that while Son of God, like the verb believe, appears much more rarely in Paul than in Johannine literature, we do find it at the climactic points of the presentation. Here Bousset can even appeal to Luke, the only place where the author of the Book of Acts uses the title O Ios tu Theu occurs in the summary of Pauline preaching. While we can follow Bousset and the history of religion school, and also Harnack and Sharps in their stress on the significance of the title Son for Paul, Bousset's hypothesis that we have to do with an independent creation of Paul is less convincing. Form-critical and traditio-critical analysis has long shown that Paul took over this title from earlier tradition. That is clear simply from the fact that he connects it with the event of his call, which will have taken place between AD 32 and 34. In particular, there are two formulations which the apostle could have taken over from the church which came before him, or more precisely existed alongside him, presumably in Syria. 1. The sending of the pre-existent Son into the world. Here we find the same syntactical pattern in Romans 8:3 and Galatians 4:4. God is the subject, followed by a verb of sending as predicate. The object is the Son, followed by a final clause introduced by ina, which explains the soteriological significance of the sending. We often find this statement formulated in the same way, independently of Pauline tradition in the Johannine writings. On the other hand, the theological interpretation is typically Pauline: liberation from the power of sin and the law, and the appointment of the believer to the relationship of being as Son of God himself. Wait a moment. Let's read it. Romans 8:3 and Galatians 4:4. Let's go to Romans 8:3. Romans 8:3. Toigar adinaton tu nomu en o istheni diatis sarkos, o theos ton eαυτού ion pempsas en ομοιώματι, sarkos αμαρτίας και περί αμαρτίας κατέκρινεν την αμαρτίαν εν τη σαρκή. God is the subject, followed by a verb of sending as predicate. The object is Son, followed by a final clause introduced by ina. I don't see an ina. Oh, verse 4. Ina to dikeoma to nomu plirothi enimintis mikata sarka. Peripatusin ala kata pneuma. Okay, I'll have to go back and study that some more. My Greek is a little rusty. But he's saying that God is the subject, followed by a verb of sending as predicate. The object is the Son, followed by a final clause introduced by ina, which explains the soteriological significance of the sending. Okay. We often find this statement formulated as okay, I read that already. Okay. Number 2, the giving up of the Son to death. The apostle begins the radiant conclusion of Romans 8:32. If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, will he not also give us all things with him? Okay. So I think the point is that the title Son of God is a title for Jesus which predated Paul, predated Paul's call. And the title Son of God is specifically in relation to, or specifically calling out Christ's relationship with the Father, his relationship to the Father, and is connected to the saving power of Christ. So his point is that this title for Jesus came before Paul, and therefore is not something invented by Paul. And that would contradict the idea that Paul introduced this term Son of God to Christianity, and thereby created a new religion, which is what that other guy, what was his name, Schoeps and Harnack were saying. Oops. Here we have on the one hand echoes of the Old Testament account of Isaac's sacrifice, and in addition what is presumably once again an established pattern which has also been written down in a well-known verse of the Gospel of John. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. In Galatians 2:20, Paul no longer speaks of God but of the Son as the subject of this action. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Here the title Son describes the uniqueness of the saving event, the magnitude of the sacrifice for our sake. Here again we have joining parallels, although they do not use the title Son. These formal statements about the Son of God, which therefore probably already existed in Paul's time, have two complementary focal points. The sending of the pre-existent Son into the world. 2, his being given up to death on the cross. The two themes recur in the Philippians hymn quoted at the beginning of this study, where the divine being of the pre-existent Christ and the slave's death of the incarnate Jesus are connected. Why does he say that these statements about the Son of God already existed in Paul's time? I don't see the connection there. Because they exist in the Gospel of John, which is written much, much later. Or the Epistle of John. Was the Epistle of John written before Galatians? The two themes recur in the Philippians hymn quoted at the beginning of the study, where the divine being of the pre-existent Christ and the slave's death of the incarnate Jesus are connected. The difference is that the title Son of God does not appear there. Rather, in the final act of exaltation, the crucified one is acclaimed as Kyrios, an indication of close relationship and content between the titles Kyrios and Son of God. We must also look at Colossians, the authenticity of which is disputed. Here we find hymnic expressions where the subject is again the beloved Son. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for in him all things were created. Even here the reference to death on the cross cannot be absent at the end. Here, however, it is not a self-emptying as in Philippians, but the work of an all-embracing reconciliation of the world. We will not go more closely into the many problems of the hymn at this point, as it seems to have a clearly post-Pauline character. We shall keep to those features which we find again in Paul himself. Okay, so he's saying that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for in him all things were created. He's saying that hymn has a clearly post-Pauline character. First mention must be given to the mediation of Christ at creation. Paul alludes to it in a passage which seems like a formula. For us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. That sounds a bit like the Nicene Creed. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten of the Father, etc. The Father is the primal ground and goal of creation, whereas Christ is the mediator. At the same time, we can also see here the close connection between the titles Lord and Son of God. The fact that we have only this one statement about Christ's mediation and creation, almost one might say by chance, merely shows how little we know of the whole of Paul's theology. We only know the tip of the iceberg, fascinating though that may be. There remains a question why Paul could use the title Kyrios so much more frequently than Son of God, although the content of the two titles is closely connected and they are in part interchangeable, because they both refer to the risen and exalted Christ, while the much rarer Son of God, above all, expressed the unique relationship of the exalted Christ to God the Father. The title Kyrios, which could also be used as a form of address in prayer and acclamation, expressed above all the relation between the exalted Christ and his community or the individual believer. The form Kyrios Jesus, made up the basic confession, reduced to its briefest form by the community of the crucified and risen Jesus, who had been exalted by God and would come again. Thus Kyrios became the current title in worship and in the individual life of the believer, while the form Son of God, with its more complicated language, was kept for exceptional usage at the climax of certain theological statements. In Paul, Christ is also called Ikon, the image of God, whose radiance shines out in the proclamation of the gospel. In this concept, the idea of the mediator of revelation and that of the mediator at creation are combined. The Ikon Theou has connections with the Morphi Theou of the Philippians hymn. Indeed, one might ask whether one term does not interpret the other. Ikon Theou is image of God, and Morphi Theou will be form of God. This designation too is concerned with the soteriological significance of Christ. In him, God's image, with e Jungel, one might even say God's parable, God's real being, his love, is made visible for believers. Paul's conception of the Son of God, which was certainly not his own creation, but goes back to an earlier community tradition before Paul's letters, thus proves to be quite unique. Jesus, the recently crucified Jew, whose physical brother James, the adelphos tu Kyriou, brother of the Lord. Jesus, the recently crucified Jew, whose physical brother James, the adelphos tu Kyriou, Paul himself had personally known well, is not only the Messiah whom God has raised from the dead, but much more. Paul had personally known James well, apparently. He is identical with the divine being before all time, mediator between God and his creatures. That is, at the same time he is mediator of God's saving revelation, which, for example, accompanied Israel through the wilderness as a water-bearing rock. Born as man, he took the Jewish law upon him and died the most shameful death known to antiquity, death on a cross. I'm curious to know more about the relationship of Paul and James. As Jacob mentioned the other day in his Eisenman readings, Eisenman believes that, what's that? What was Eisenman writing about? Josephus, Josephus was writing about, did write about James and Saul and Saulus. Chapter 4, the theory of the history of religion school. There's just one page here. It is quite understandable that this new picture of Christ should be claimed to represent a new Hellenistic Christianity. R. Bultmann, who here emerges as to some extent the spokesman of the history of religion school, could describe it as basically a wholly new religion, a wholly as in completely, basically a completely new religion in contrast to the original Palestinian Christianity. Speculation of this kind must have seemed even further removed from the proclamation of Jesus as Bultmann described it following Wellhausen. Pure Judaism, pure prophetic teaching, thus completing the return of Jesus to Judaism. At the same time, the great Marburg scholar corrected Harnack's thesis of a Hellenizing of Christianity along the lines of the history of religion school. He argued that the cause of this new form was not, as was still supposed in the 19th century, under the influence of F.C. Bauer, a speculative philosophical interest on the part of Greek Gentile Christians, but a new cultic piety molded by the mystery of religion. A new cultic piety molded by the mystery religions. In his criticism of the Christological Confession of the World Council of Churches in 1950, Bultmann made this theory of the history of religion school more precise in connection with the Son of God. Quote, "For the figure of a Son deity, suffering and dying and raised again to life, is also known to the mystery religions, and Gnosticism above all is aware of the notion of the Son of God become man, of the heavenly Redeemer of become man." Unquote. Bultmann, his teachers Bousset and Holtmuller, and his followers repeated this argument ad nauseum without verifying it adequately by the ancient sources. If they were right, then a few years after the death of Jesus, an acute Hellenization, or more precisely, a syncretistic paganization of primitive Christianity, must have come about among the spiritual leaders of Jewish Christianity like Barnabas, or the former scribe and Pharisee Paul. Moreover, this must have taken place either in Palestine itself or in neighboring Syria, say in Damascus or Antioch. In that case, the criticism of Paul's Christology by the Jewish philosopher of religion H.J. Schopf would have been quite justified. It is clear that such extraordinary historical development would have been in radical and irreconcilable contradiction to the preaching of Jesus. In that case, a decision would have to be made between Jesus and Paul. In what follows, we shall attempt to illuminate the development of the title Son of God, moving back from Paul to the origins of Christian belief. In so doing, we shall consider whether there really was a fundamental breach in many respects in the rise of Christology between Jesus and Paul, or whether it is not the case that, at least after the death of Jesus or the Easter event, it is possible to see an inner trend in Christological thought which contradicts Herbert Braun's theory and shows that Christology was not a random, quote, variable, unquote, but the consistent, quote, unquote, constant. Chapter 5, The Meaning of Son of God and the History of Religions. I'll call it there. Seems like we're just about to get into the meat of this little book. So that was through page 19 of this 93-page book. Very interesting. I think this is exactly what I was hoping it would be. That directly gets into the discussions that Father Stephen and Jacob have had. Father Stephen didn't. I don't recall Father Stephen actually getting into debating or going into great detail as to why Paul comes out of Judaism, or the Paul in Judaism, or whatever he was saying. But it seems that Jacob would subscribe to Harnack and Schopf's theories that Paul represents a major reconfiguring or a major change in Christianity. The theory that Jesus was venerated and revered as a rabbi who was crucified, and then he through Paul's efforts took on divinity, or took on divine titles. So seems to me that Martin Hengel is saying that those divine titles belong to Jesus prior to Paul. So that would be interesting if that's the case. And I'm looking forward to reading more and finding out exactly why he thinks that's the case. So let's see, how long have I been going here? 45 minutes. So this will probably take, if I do that, about five episodes. Join me again next time. Thank you.